We might kick off the session just now. If people have just got here, welcome to Keep Left 2018, hosted by Solidarity. This session's called Right to Fight, Right to Strike. How do we really change the rules? We've got four speakers here today. Well, we've got three speakers, and hopefully Denis will be joining us soon. We've got Professor John Buchanan, who's the head of the business analytics here at Sydney Uni, who's written about wage stagnation and what that's got to do with industrial relations law. We've got Giovanna Bonelli, Giovanna Bonelli, who's a delegate with the trains with the RTBU, and we've got Erima Dall from the MUA, all to speak to us here today. And then we'll have a room for discussion at the end. So yeah, first up, John.
Sure. Look, I'm just wondering, is it better if maybe people up the back come down the front? Because we can have more of a discussion then.
Typical teacher.
No. It's communication. So, look, the question I've posed is, what can socialist activists do to get a better right to strike? And I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference for organising me here today. Whilst I am an employee of the University of Sydney, I'm not speaking in my official capacity today. I'd like to make that clear. The Australian newspaper likes to get transcripts of speeches like this and use them against me. So I am speaking as a citizen who has many experiences. I come out of the environment movement. I was originally politicised through the anti-uranium movement in the 70s, was a student activist in the 80s and 90s, and then was a union activist in the 80s and 90s until the current. Though I've been not so much an activist but a labour market researcher for the last 20 years or so. And I suppose the reason I'm here is because I have had a lot of experience in studying both the labour market, but also I've spent a lot of time looking at workplace delegates on the job. So when I was leading a research centre for 25 years, I visited a lot of workplaces. So I wanted to talk about four things. So if the question is, what can socialist activists do to get a better right to strike? I think there's a moral dimension, an analytical dimension, an organisational dimension, and a personal dimension. The moral dimension is this. I think it's the left's been on the run now pretty badly for about the last 30 years, and I think that's starting to change. But I do think we've got to hold ourselves out against being demoralised. And when it comes to the moral dimension here, we've got to note the justice of our cause. The right to strike is vital as a means to an end. It's vital for getting fair shares of wealth and especially wages. And I'll be stark, and it's not something you hear much about today, the right to strike is important for defending democracy. When democracy is under threat, it is often a general strike of workers that will defend that democracy. It's often general strikes of workers that open up societies to the evolution to a more democratic mode of organisation. And we've seen that across the world, Brazil, South Korea, South Africa. In the 80s and 90s, it was general strikes in Eastern Europe that ultimately brought down the end of those Stalinist regimes. But the right to strike isn't just good as a means to an end, it is also an end in itself. And in the course of an industrial dispute, people learn the disciplines of collective action. And it's very hard in many spheres of life, particularly when society is organised around capitalist means, it's very hard for people to get a taste of what collective action look like outside of a market realm. And that's why industrial action is so important, as if you like a school for mass democracy. But then ultimately, when it comes to the moral dimension, I'm an old-time socialist, and I basically believe the cause of labour is the hope of the world. And I don't think that sentiment's expressed enough. So when we're thinking about these issues, it's not just a technical matter, it's not just a matter of changing the law, it is actually a deep moral struggle about fair shares, defending democracy, and actually offering a different vision for the future. So the second issue is the analytical dimension. And here, I think the labour movement in Australia has got itself into a terrible mess because it actually hasn't had clear objectives since the Accord. The big shift in the 80s, and I was a supporter of this at the time, is that the labour movement took responsibility for running the economy. it took responsibility for macroeconomic stabilisation, and it reduced industrial action in return for getting gains in what was then called the social wage. But that meant that the union movement got tied up in thinking about running a market society and lost its broader vision. And for me, the analytical challenge is have clarity of objectives. And in this area, it's very simple. It's about building the means of solidarity across the community. Solidarity is not something that's talked about much. I mean, it's the name of the organisation here. But that's more than a brand. The issue of solidarity is one about bringing out the inherent social nature of humanity. But then there's the complex question of how do you make solidarity real? And here I think there are two issues which currently limit the way in which we think about the right to strike. The first is the labour market reach of the right, and the second is the subject matter of the right. When I'm talking about the labour market reach of the right to strike, you've got to remember Australians only got the official right to strike in 1991. Let's remember that. Up to 1991, all strikes were illegal. Let's get those facts on the table. I don't think people appreciate that. Now, the Australian workforce had decades, in some cases centuries, of traditions of striking, but they were all illegal. And the industrial relations system learned to tolerate illegal strikes, and there were certain times when the law tried to strike them down, and that was quite successful in the 50s and 60s. But there was a very famous culmination of the punitive use of the law around the Clary-O'Shea dispute in the late 60s, and that's when basically the union movement, just through weight of numbers, made the system ungovernable. If workers couldn't take the right to strike, then they would just stop the economy, and they paralysed particularly the Victorian blue-collar sector, and basically employers and governments backed up prosecuting. Now, that sitting below the surface, though, was the law which always said all these strikes were illegal, and the most fundamental one, with the first big gain by employers and right-wing governments, was Section 45D of the Trade Practices Act, which was so-called the secondary boycotts legislation, which is basically prohibiting solidarity action. And I think when we think about the right to strike today, the right to strike in terms of labour market reach is simply defined in terms of the enterprise. So the rights that were given in the 1991 Act basically said, as we wind back the arbitration system, we're moving into a world of enterprise bargaining. Because the state can't be the counterforce in wage bargaining, we have to give workers some limited power. So that was where you got the notion of protected action. But that was all with a big circle written around it, which was you could only take protected action as it affected the enterprise and as it affected the bargaining period. So the first thing, if we're thinking about how do we make solidarity real, is that we've got to think about the labour market reach. And we've got to have the right to strike at an industry level, and we've got to have the right to strike in sympathy with other workers. So you've got to repeal the limits on the enterprise unit of reference, and you've got to repeal the equivalent Section 45 D and E of the Trade Practices Act, which prohibit so-called secondary boycotts. Can I just say this is probably, for younger activists, it's probably something that's quite foreign to them, but when I was growing up as an activist, I was in the Public Service Union, and we had a number of disputes in the 80s, and often compliance with our calls to action was patchy, but when the TWU would not cross our pickets, that's when the management would listen. And it was basically those secondary boycotts by the TWU that enhanced the bargaining power of white-collar workers. That then increased the standing of us as delegates on the job and allowed us to then get more members. So the right to take solidarity action is vital if the movement is to renew. It's very hard for any one group of workers on their own to grow. I mean, you've got to try, but where others can support you, it makes a huge difference. The second issue, when we're thinking about what do we mean by solidarity and changing it, we've got to think about the subject matter of the right to strike, because the right to protected action under the 1991 Act is confined to what are called allowable matters. And I think when we're thinking about the right to strike, we should be basically saying, as a democratic right, workers should be able to take strike action over anything that they think is important. And that has made a huge difference in Australia. when Medicare was under, or when Medibank was under threat of the Fraser government in the mid-70s, the union movement organised a nationwide strike in defence of the public health system. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Builders Labourers Federation took responsibility for urban planning in Sydney and called that the Green Bands. That was vital for restoring and saving what we now know as the ROCs. If big business and the government of the day had had their way, the ROCs would now be just one series of high-rise apartments. So when people say this is irresponsible, that you want to open up the right to strike around non-industrial matters, just point them to the ROCs. If that had been enforced, then Australia would have lost one of its basically tourist gems. So that's the third issue then, is the organisational dimension. So my question is, how can socialist activists get to a better right to strike? You've got to think in an organisational sense. And what I think is relatively underappreciated, particularly on the activist left, is the importance of building alliances. And I might be being a bit provocative here, but I would actually say in the current situation, the real strategy must be to get behind the ACTU's Change the Rules campaign. Now, I know the ACTU is pretty closely aligned with the ALP. I've had my differences with it over many years. But let's not underestimate the significance of the Change the Rules campaign. The ACTU led the push in the late 80s and early 90s to embrace enterprise bargaining. It was their laws with ACTU endorsement that limited the right to strike to the enterprise. When the ACTU leadership now leads and says, we got it wrong, we've got to change the rules, that is a very significant shift. And I don't think people realise the ideological significance of that. That creates a very different space to what union strategy has been conducted in for the last 3 decades. So when it comes to organising, I think you've got to think in terms of organising in support of the ACTU, not as loyal flunkies. I mean, you can be quite active in the way you do it, but it's not a bad reference point. As somebody who's been following IR policy for a long time, it's been hard to actually seriously get behind the ACTU for quite some time. And don't underestimate the significance of that. There are not many countries around the world where the national union force is pushing a position that everyone can get behind. If you look around the world, most union movements are fractured. You know, they're fractured between Catholic unions and political unions, or they're fractured between left and right. Australia still has a relatively unified union movement, and that has been massively successful. We saw that on the waterfront in '98. There was basically no other union movement in the world that could have withstood the assault that the MUA stood, but the MUA was fantastic. They were disciplined, but they could not have done it on their own. That was a massive community campaign with the ACTU coordinating it, and we've seen rights at work. Once again, let's not forget, no other country in the Western world has had a government defeated by a union-led campaign for about 40 years. That's significant. So when I'm saying think about working with the ACTU, it's not a waste of time. There is form there, and I think it's something we should work with and not take for granted. When I'm saying we've got to look at working in an alliance, I think we've also got to look beyond the industrial sphere. And here I would say in the current situation, the two really big fundamental issues are climate change and work health and safety, and the whole issue of well-being. It's now clear that the future of capitalism is pretty much incompatible with the future of the planet, and it's pretty much incompatible with people leading decent lives. And I think when we're thinking about the right to strike, we shouldn't be just thinking about it in an industrial sphere. We should be thinking about, like the builders' labourers did in the 60s and 70s, they were thinking about the urban form. They were thinking about workers as citizens, not just workers as productive beings. But there are also very important struggles in the realms of gender, race, and in marginalised communities. And I can see big issues coming up in the NDIS. There's going to be literally an army of very contingent and poorly organised workers being funded by the state. We should be thinking about how you link labour standards to the support for marginalised groups who are dependent on disability support and the like. My final section is the personal dimension if we're thinking about how to improve the right to strike. And I've got 2 points to make here. We've got to both value and care for ourselves. as somebody who has been a researcher and been out to literally hundreds of workplaces, I can report back to you that a workplace that has an active union delegate in it is very different to one that doesn't. So when you're a union delegate, you often feel like you're banging your head against the wall, you know, you're losing all your free time, you're not spending enough time with friends and family. But trust me, when an outsider like me comes in and looks at it, you just see a huge difference in the confidence the workforce it has in itself, its ability to get things done, to stop problems emerging. So when we're thinking about this, do value, it's not just a kind of Sisyphus type struggle of, you know, you've got to struggle because you have to, it's a struggle because it makes a difference. But the final thing is, and I finish with a personal note, and some people might say this is a touchy-feely side, but, you know, somebody who's approaching 60, I would like to say that there is often a sense of urgency around these campaigns. You know, the global warming is getting really bad, deterioration in employment conditions are really bad, there is a sense of urgency, we've just got to do what we can to discipline and hopefully transcend capitalism. But I think often in pursuing that, we can not spend enough time with our family, friends and lovers. And I think when we're thinking about the right to strike, we've got to moderate our commitment to a very important cause and balance that with a commitment to also looking after those who are closest to us. Because from where I sit, the definition of socialism is creating a world where it's easier to have friends, and we've got to practice that in our daily lives. So just to finish up, what can socialist activists do to get the better right to strike? There's the moral dimension. Have confidence, you know, history's on your side. There's the analytical dimension. Be clear about the objectives. It's about solidarity, and that goes to how you define your reach in the labour market and the issues over which you take action. There's the organisational dimension, and I think that's about building alliances, and in this case I think working under the umbrella of the ACTU. And there's the personal dimension, which is value what you do, but especially look after yourselves and your colleagues. Thank you.
All right. Got it here if you can.
Oh yeah, cool. No, I just needed my speech.
Oh yeah, true.
Because that'll help. Hi guys, my name's Giovanna. I'm a train driver and an RTBU delegate, so Rail, Tram and Bus Union Locomotive Division delegate. I just want to talk a little bit about earlier this year when we were going through our enterprise agreement. We had our right to strike taken away. So I'm not sure if you guys heard about it. It was on the news. There's a little bit of drama with the trains around that time. So I'll just give you a broad, like a brief recap. So our EA expired in September 2017. We surveyed our members, we compiled our log of claims. Broadly, we asked for paid domestic violence leave, redeployment and redundancy clause reinserted in our EA. We wanted timeframes around disciplinary investigations. We wanted a cap on master roster changes and a 6% wage increase. So we negotiated with the boss for near 4 months, and they didn't come to the table with anything resembling a fair offer. So we petitioned the Unfair Work Commission for a protected action ballot. It was granted, and the ballots were sent out to the combined rail unions, which is, there's several unions that participate in our EA, CFMEU, ETU, Professionals Australia, ASU, RTBU, and I'm sure there's another one I'm forgetting, but roughly. Disappointingly, of the several unions that participated in the ballot, only the RTBU and Professionals Australia actually got their ballot up. Contained within the ballot were several forms of action. One was work stoppages ranging from 1 hour to 72 hours. We had the right to wear union apparel at work, a ban on all overtime, and also an indefinite strike. So we got a 58% return on the ballot. Of the 58%, 95% voted in favour of work stoppages, 90% voted in favour of OT bans, and 84% voted in favour of an indefinite strike. Based on the membership comment, it would seem that the majority of members that voted were train drivers and train guards. Because for 12 months leading up to the expiration of our EA, we were subjected to daily breaches of our conditions, unilaterally denied leave, micromanaging and bullying in an attempt to coerce us into doing overtime, and also a disregard for safety by the boss in place of on-time running. So the RTBU gave notice to the boss that we would commence action, we would wear union apparel, we would implement an overtime ban, and if no fair agreement could be reached, we would strike for 24 hours. And just keeping in mind that these were actions that were approved by the Fair Work Commission and voted on by our members, as is required by the Fair Work Act. So what did the boss and the Tory government do? They threw their toys out of the cot and they shit themselves. They ran down to their good mates in the Unfair Work Commission, and after hearing both sides of the argument, it took the Commissioner 30 minutes to reach his decision. The Commissioner suspended the strike. He stated that he was satisfied that our strike threatened or would threaten to endanger life, the personal safety or health of the population, and would cause significant damage to the Australian economy. So train drivers striking endangers life. Who are these people who are mortally injured and with life-threatening conditions catching trains to the hospital? There's got to be a better way, right? I don't know, like maybe an ambulance? And the second point, cause significant damage to the Australian economy. Well, last time I checked, that was the fucking point of a strike. And mind you, it's the same strike that the Fair Work Commission had approved as part of our protected action ballot application. So it's bad enough that we have these anti-worker laws, but we have to jump through all their hoops only to get the rug pulled out from under us. So it was a sad day, not only for us, the RTBU, but also for workers everywhere. Subsequently, the boss put out his own EA, not endorsed by the RTBU. That EA consisted of a 3% pay rise for 3 years and a $1,000 bribe. So sadly, it was voted up by a very small margin. We had 52.8% of employees in Sydney Trains vote yes, and 50.8% in New South Wales Trains vote yes. The members were defeated and they voted it up because they thought we couldn't get any better. They believed the boss's lies, and they understood now what a lot of workers in Australia have already understood, that the Fair Work Commission aren't fair and that the industrial laws in this country are bullshit and they're only in place to crush the worker. But instead of buying into the fallacy that the worker has no rights, we should have stood up, pushed back and gone out anyway. But instead, we went back to work for a boss who continues to rely on unsustainable overtime to facilitate an unrealistic timetable, who every day seeks to coerce us to breach our shift limits, fatigue scores, our limits on fatigue-causing mileage jobs, who continues to deny its seriously fatigued workforce annual leave due to operational requirements, and who just recently announced plans to do away with 300 plus guards on its new intercity fleet. So the only thing these people understand is their train's not running. And just to highlight my point, recently we had a water system fail in one of our largest meal rooms at Central. So on top of the countless injustices we have to deal with every day, they can't even provide us with basic facilities. So the boss told us it would take about a week to fix and the train crew would just have to suck it up. So the RTBU Locomotive Division told them they could take as much time as they wanted. They could take a year. It was fine because we were closing their meal room. Now, surprise, surprise, it took them an hour to find an emergency plumber and fixed the water system, or replaced it, sorry. Now, what it meant for them, or what it means for crew, that meal room being shut down, is that we would have to go to another location to have our lunch break. What it means for the business is that we are no longer in place to work their trains. and therefore their trains don't run. So anyone who thinks that anything good we ever got, we got because the boss was a good bloke is delusional. We're just numbers and a commodity to be used and abused for the sole purpose of keeping their trains running. So everything good we've had to fight for. So just touching on your point, John. So Sally McManus came out and said that unjust laws should be broken. So tell me, what is more unjust than having our fundamental right to strike taken away? Yet, I'm a little bit annoyed with the ACTU because during our strike, or leading up to our strike, there was radio silence from the ACTU. They didn't come out in support of our strike. They didn't call for other unions to stand in solidarity with the RTBU. They did nothing. But what they did do was, after our defeat, use our defeat as a branding opportunity for their hashtag Change the Rules campaign. So we can no longer rely on the ACTU and Labor to direct the action needed to take our power back. Because after a successful Your Rights at Work campaign that got Labor re-elected, they made only token, fluffy, bullshit changes to the legislation and left all the anti-union laws. So we're deluded if we think that Labor's just going to change the laws and give us our power back. Because Labor have forgotten by whom they were formed and they believe that the worker, they believe they no longer answer to the worker, but the worker to them. So I'm sorry, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So I, for one, am sick of hearing day in and day out of workers across all industries getting fucked over by the laws of the land, and I've had enough. It's not only time we change the rules, but it's time we change the future and any current and future governments who will not give us back our fundamental right to strike. It's time we stand up and fight, because we're not going to win their game because it's their rules. The boss may think they have the power, the money, the mates in high places, but we have the army. So I'm sick of tired of being told what's good for us, and it's time to take back what's ours. And if we can't do it via the ballot box, then there'll come a time where our army will stand united and unjust laws will be broken, and I hope they're fucking ready. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Erima. I'm a rank and file member of the NUA. Shout out to my comrades over here. And I'm also a member of Solidarity and have been an organiser of the Right to Strike New South Wales grouping, which is a bit of a recent phenomenon. So kind of, want to say a bit of a few things from each of those perspectives. I mean, just to start with the question that was posed for this session, right to fight, right to strike, how do we really change the rules? I want to just start by giving what I think is the short answer to that question. One is everyone should walk out of here with a leaflet for the Right to Strike rally on the 6th, which is a weekday, and do what you can to get your delegates, get your workplace out on strike that day, or get delegates leave, or whatever can be done to get people to that rally on the 6th, which the CFMU and the MUA have already declared as a strike rally. The other thing I think we need to do to really change the rules is build a movement that can make sure that what happened to Sydney trains never happens again. And I want to kind of go back over that point and how I think we can do that. But just to start by having a little bit of a look at some of the hypocrisy I think we face, and just how stacked the laws are against us, and the narrative that as unionists we have to deal with. This week, a couple of federal court judges declared that the CFMEU, the Construction, Mining, Forestry and Energy Union, now also joined by the Maritime Union, that the CFMEU deserves to be deregistered, and that they're the most recidivist corporate offender in Australian history. Now I read this in the Financial Review. On page 10 of this same paper, the NAB Bank admits to breaking the law once a week. On page 8, our superannuation funds are being spent on junkets for bosses at the Australian Open. I could go on, but I think you see the point I'm making here. They call the CFMEU the worst corporate offender in Australian history. I think maybe they meant the worst offender of corporations. What are these offences? You know, entering sites without permits, striking without permission, putting work bans on companies that have killed members of the public due to lack of safety. Well, it might be criminal to break the law, but it's these laws that are the real crime. And that's what, you know, we've got to, that's why we're here today, and those are the laws that we have to break. Now, these courts upheld a maximum penalty of $306,000. That's union dues. That's our, you know, members' money. And they did that explicitly to put pressure on that union to pull its construction division into line. You know, it's very, very clearly politically motivated. Strikes have never been legal in Australia, as John mentioned. They were outlawed federally by the Conciliation and Arbitration Act of 1904, but they were largely treated with contempt because they weren't associated with really much penalties. The courts would order you back to work, you go back to work the next day, you walk out again. But these days, fines are used actually as one of the primary weapons against unions, and they work because they mostly actually target the union. Not they can be used to target individuals, but they're mostly used to put the unions under threat of bankruptcy, and that actually puts us pressure on the union leadership to pull its own members into line to avoid bankruptcy of the union. There's a really important historical example from the 50s and 60s under the penal powers, which was another time where very, very severe anti-union laws and penalties were imposed by the Menzies government. To the point that a union leader, the Tramways union leader Clary O'Shea, was sent to jail because he refused to pay the fines or even reveal where the union funds were, and as a consequence was sent to jail. Now, this wasn't just some kind of random spontaneous thing. It was actually something that the union movement built up towards for years in advance, preparing to have a showdown. And in response to Clary O'Shea's being jailed, there was a general strike, which not only freed him but defeated those laws. But it defeated those laws not actually by targeting the legislation or having the acts rewritten immediately, but by making those laws a dead letter that no boss and no government had the guts to use because they knew the consequences. And I think that's a clue to how we really change these rules. We have to make the rules, the fines, the threats, something that no boss and no government has the guts to use against us. And the truth is that actually happens. It actually is a political choice whether the boss is going to take you to the Fair Work Commission when you go on an illegal strike, whether the government's going to get the Fair Work Ombudsman to pursue fine costs. And actually there's a lot of examples of when they drop that. They decide it's not worth the hassle. You know, it's happened, you know, for us in the MUA, taken a lot of strike days to get, you know, permanent jobs for safety conditions. It's happened, I know, for the CFMEU when they went on a national day of action of illegal strike. But we actually have to take that further to the point that we smash the laws all together and they're not prepared to use any of them or use the threat of them. And I think the key to doing that is to rebuild rank and file union strength. The delegates networks, the shop floor meetings, the strikes, all these sort of structures that have significantly dwindled since the 90s, where the Hawke and then Keating government introduced what John was talking about, the idea of protected and unprotected strikes, which then opened the way actually for the Liberal government to create huge penalties associated with taking unprotected strikes. And part of the effect of that was not just to make most strikes illegal, but by creating only one little window every 3 years when you're bargaining for your next contract, to make that the time that you can take strike action, it means that the union's muscles, aren't being worked every day. It's not every day or every week you're talking about what are we angry about this week? What are we going to do about this injustice on the job? These workers are being sacked. These ones have been stood down. This safety issue. Actually, let's walk out today. Let's walk out after lunch. For that kind of level of activity, you need a lot of structures, of regular meetings. When you restrict striking only to a small window once every 3 years, you lose a lot of that infrastructure that is the historical backbone of the union movement. Some of the anti-strike laws that we face, I mentioned striking outside bargaining period. John's mentioned the solidarity strikes, taking strike action in support of your fellow workmates, also for political reasons, and that can be something as basic as the ABCC or penalty rate, something that's a government policy. You're not allowed to strike against those in a way that might do damage to the economy, what Gigi spoke about, which is pointed out very well. It's that's it, right? Like, we're about to go into EBA bargaining on the wharves. If we do that on all 3 terminals at once, or even 2 terminals at once, even if it's legal, that immediately can be struck down as causing significant economic damage to Australia. That takes away the power right from the start. It's illegal to go on strike without giving the boss notice. Let that one sink in. Just giving away, your game plan. It's illegal to go without doing a secret ballot. And many issues as well to do with access of union officials having free access to the site. There's all kind of paperwork and bullshit you have to go through to go on site. I just want to talk about the Change the Rules campaign, because I think both what John and Gigi have said are true, and we need to kind of actually come at this with a with and against kind of approach. We need to be with the Change the Rules campaign in that it is a really important, significant break by the leading union body against what it has historically sold to us. It sold us the Kool-Aid, and now it's telling us that it's the poison chalice. It's pretty annoying, but it's like better late than never. But it's also the case that I don't think there's any evidence that they have learned the lessons from the Your Rights at Work campaign. And in some ways, I think actually the Change the Rules is shaping up to be even more of a purely electoral campaign than what Your Rights at Work was, which had a larger component, actually, of street demonstrations, of filling up the domain, of blocking roads. I've heard stories of 400 construction workers blocking the M5, things, we haven't really seen a lot of that. I think the issues that the ACTU is speaking to about termination of EBAs, hyper kind of casualisation, insecurity in the workforce, stolen wages, and the need to confront unjust laws, that's all resonating with people for a reason. But I went to the launch last night, on Thursday night, which was held in the marginal seat. It was the Reid and Banks, and it was announced that this was a launch of the union's election campaign. They weren't, shy about that, and we were told that it's going to be up to us to change these rules. It's going to be up to us to make a difference. But what they're actually asking people to do was door knock. And again, it was quite explicitly said that without a change of government, there's nothing we can do about this. Inequality is going to grow. These problems are going to continue. Now, I think it's absolutely true that we have to throw out this rotten Turnbull government, but we have to do so in a way that prepares us for the Labor government. And I think if you want an example of how to do that, look at what's happening in New Zealand. right now, where strikes have massively increased under a new Labor government precisely because people are sick and tired of being told that they have to wait and that they have to wait for Labor to fix something. And we've got a speaker at our conference, a nurse from New Zealand, who I hope can elaborate on that in some of this discussion. We'll be speaking further through the conference as well. But that idea that we can't just wait for Labor to fix things or rely on Labor is a reality that people are living. People have already seen their pay checks get cut because of penalty rate cuts. People have already had their EBAs terminated. We heard from a speaker at the Change the Rules launch from Ausgrid, where it's been privatised and people have been sacked. Those people have already been sacked. You can't say that the answer to getting their jobs back is to go and door knock in a marginal electorate. We need to build the power on the job, exactly what Gigi was talking about. Those little examples are so important in actually fighting and changing something in the here and now. And as an MUA member, we've all experienced some of this very recently, in many ways, but significantly there was a very nearly fatal accident that happened at our terminal, and the conditions that happened in were issues that we'd been raising for months about safety on the job, traffic management conditions, engineering conditions. And the first thing that happened after that accident was we were ordered back to work immediately in exactly the same machines and exactly the same conditions. And the company went to put out every trick in the book it could to threaten, intimidate, coerce us back. It dragged 72 individual members through the courts, charged us with unlawful industrial action, locked out the union, forced us to hold meetings through a barbed wire fence, wouldn't hand over training booklets, wouldn't hand over CCTV footage, spent 2 weeks, in secret meetings with its lawyers instead of talking to our delegates. We weren't going to wait for the Change the Rules campaign or the election of a Labor government. We had to take action then and there on the spot. And thank God for the very strong delegates, the HSRs that we had that said we are not one single worker is getting back up in that machine until these changes have been made. And that is how we won. We won that campaign because we held our ground. Okay, I've run out of time. I'll just finish by saying that I think one of the concrete things, how we've been able to bring together some of this politics into the Change the Rules campaign is by launching the Right to Strike campaign, which is supposed to be a sort of intervention that can both be with the Change the Rules campaign but specifically raise that demand within it. So I'd encourage people to join that. As I said, take the leaflets for the rally. There's also a delegates meeting coming up this Friday, 9:30 at Trades Hall, I believe.
Thursday.
Friday.
And I think actually we've seen that demand gain quite a bit of currency. And I think the importance of the right to strike is everything I talked about how do you win things in the here and now, but it's also what John talked about. Striking is how we shape our world, it's how we learn to govern ourselves, and it's how we can ultimately change not only the rules, but the system. I'll leave it there.
I'm Denis McNamara. I'm a delegate with the CFMEU Construction Division. I also sit on the New South Wales Committee of Management, and I'm also a delegate to their national conference. To talk about the right to strike, I think we need to understand our position as wage slaves, and to do that we should read Marx's masterpiece Capital. In it he gives us the finest analysis of labour ever written. Now I'm going to plagiarise a little bit here as well, so forgive me. He reveals that money for investment and production goods, machines, are the accumulation of our past labours. He shows that capitalists control those means of production because their economic clout is backed by political force. Capitalists use their control of our past labours to make us sell our living labour to add ever more value to the things we make. With that sale, our labour is subject to capital on paper. However, its managers still have to make our labour subject in practice. We must be disciplined to the demands of expansion during every second of the working period. Above all, to withdraw our free labour is a crime. The ruling class can never accept our right to strike. They must always claw back every right we win. Fair Work Australia, Australia's protected action, protects the bosses from our actions. Capitalists do not own us in the way that Romans owned their slaves, nor do they own us for life as they do machines and raw materials, nor do they own our children in the way they own the offspring of sheep and cattle. How then are we any kind of slave? To answer that question, it's important we spell out what free labour means under the rule of capital. The first aspect is that our forebears were freed of the resources to keep themselves alive. Once driven off the land, they were free to sell themselves for their dinner, or to starve, beg or steal. Our class inherits that choice. Secondly, we were free to move about. We are not tied to a piece of soil like serfs. Instead, we are compelled to follow capital in search of paid work. Thirdly, our employers set us free when they sack us. Yeah. Now, I could go on, but then it'll turn into a discussion about Marx's capital instead of the right to strike. So I'll give you some personal experience of strike action. 35 years ago, I entered the workforce as a labourer with the BLF. And it was normal back then to take strike action over safety issues, conditions of work, and even, as been spoken here today, progressing our political and social aims. In the smoko shed, you were told and educated about all the strikes that were taken in the past to win the conditions we had back then. You know, the old blokes told us how long they went on strike to get the sheds we were sitting in, how long they went on strike to get long service leave, sick pay, holiday pay, all of those things. They could recount the amount of time that they were out on the grass and also the jobs they were on that took that strike action. The difference back then, because like was spoken to before, strike action in Australia has never been legal. Never. Only under the bargaining conditions. That didn't stop us from doing it. Yeah? We still took strike action regularly. And back in those days, we got paid for it. We would go on strike, and if it was for 2 days or 10 weeks, we didn't go back to work until they paid us every cent of lost time for that strike action. Yeah? So then they outlawed payment for strike pay. So now it's illegal for the company to pay you, and they can get fined and in trouble if they pay you for strike action. We also used to back each other up. You know, if one union was out on strike, we'd go out in support of them. Secondary boycotts. We did it all the time to help each other. To avoid that, the Labor Party brought in sections 45D and E, which made it illegal for us to go on strike to support somebody else. That was the Labor Party that did that to us. So, again, in the construction industry, we still take illegal strike action today, regularly. If something's unsafe, we stop work, we don't do it. If someone gets sacked unreasonably, we stop work until they're re-employed. If our wages that we demand aren't met, we walk out the gate until they are. And that was, but we don't do it as often as we did back then. And back then the strikes we used to take around side allowance. And that was what got everybody used to taking strike action or industrial action. We would wait till the job got started. We'd get a couple of structural trades on there, scaffolders, riggers, steel fixers, concreters. Then we would say, okay guys, we'd organise and we'd say, we're going on strike for a side allowance on this job. We might ask for $2 and get $1 an hour, but we won. We got more than we had before. And we showed every worker on that site that if you take part in industrial action, you'll win. And we also showed the boss that if they mess with us, they'll lose. So for the rest of that job, they were frightened of us and they listened to us. And most times they met our demands without us having to walk out again. That's been taken away and we're probably a victim of our own success. We now do enterprise agreements without any involvement with the worker. We now have a structure that says whatever the job's worth, that's how much side allowance you'll get. So when a young guy comes to my site now and he comes to me as the delegate, he doesn't say, Dennis, are we going to go on strike for side allowance? He says, how much is the side allowance on this job? Because he's used to it being handed to him without taking any action himself. And that's why young people today don't want to take part in strike action, because they're not used to it anymore. And they're worried about what they'll lose. Or some of them, the boss is a great bloke. Why would I want to upset him? Look at all these things he gives me. And we try to explain them to, no boss has ever given us anything without a struggle. Nothing. Boss doesn't get up one day and go, they're all great workers, I'm going to give them a pay rise. Or I'll give them a shed to sit in, and a pie warmer, and an air conditioner, because they're good guys. No, we struggled for every one of those conditions that people take for granted today. They become laws. You know, work cover now says, on a building site you must provide a shed and a pie warmer and an air conditioner. We didn't have them years ago. The government now says you must pay superannuation. It was building workers that took a pay cut, or we forewent a pay rise to introduce super to ourselves. Back then, only bankers and rich people got that, not building workers, and they told us it could never work because we're itinerant workers. The building gets done and you go. We said, no, we can introduce a scheme and it will work. And now it's law. Every worker in the country must be paid super. So, the rally we've got coming up on the 6th, on Thursday the 6th of September at 10:30 at, what's it called, the park across from Central Station?
Belmore.
Yeah. Belmore Park. So how we organised and got that rally. Us as the CFMEU, we took a decision that the ACTU and the Labor Council in New South Wales, or Unions New South Wales, aren't doing enough. It's great to have Sally with her campaign and change the rules, but I've said to Sally face to face, you're not doing enough. You can't just talk, you have to do something. You know, and what you need to do is call people out into the street and march them down the street, not just worry about door knocking and political campaigns. You need to get workers out in the street to show the ruling class and the government that we're not going to put up with their garbage any longer. They don't want to do that. For what reasons, they're their own. So we decided to do it ourselves. Yeah, we said we're not going to just sit back. And it's not the first time we've done it either. You know, we've called these rallies before. Unions New South Wales have endorsed it. They've told all their other unions to come along, and we hope that we get some people along too there. I went to a Unions New South Wales meeting where I put a resolution that they do endorse it. I also presented them with a petition with over 1,000 signatures, calling on them to call a combined delegates meeting in the lead up to it to discuss this with our other unions. Us as the CFMEU were having a BTG meeting on the 24th anyway, with the plumbers, the sparkies, ourselves, the metal workers. They asked could they tack onto that, and we said of course you can. So that's the date. The combined delegates meeting is Friday the 24th. I don't hold much hope in they might send all the stuff out to their unions, but if you look at the last rally, we actually forced them to call the rally. We put New South Wales, Unions New South Wales in a position where we were going to call the rally anyway, and we said to them, do you want to be leading it? And they said yes. They called the rally, they did nothing to get anybody there. And I told them that the other Thursday night. Their turnout and to the delegates there from the other unions, I can't help it, I just say how I see things. And I said your turnout at that rally was piss poor, and I would hope that you'd make a better effort at this one, because that's what we want. This is a strike.
It's 10 minutes.
All right, I'll finish off. This is a strike that, that is in work hours. We're taking strike action. We're voting on our jobs. We're calling mass meetings on site, and we're taking votes to walk out on strike. That's illegal. We're told it's illegal. Doesn't stop us from doing it. The last time we did it, we got all letters from the ABCC saying, if we do this, it's illegal, you'll get fined. We ignored them. They haven't sent them to us this time. Maybe it's a bit early, I don't know. But they haven't sent them to us. Look, just quickly, I wanted to touch on how extreme they go. We put union flags on our cranes. CFMEU, Eureka flags. We're told by the ABCC we can't do that. We don't stop doing it. We just keep flying them. I've been taken to Fair Work Australia by my company for refusing to take down union flags off our cranes. Now, that's how extreme it's getting. We deal with the ABCC, we deal with that every day of the week. Our organisers are fined by them, our union is constantly fined, and our officials are constantly charged. That's why what we're talking about, and it's on our leaflet downstairs as well, we're not talking about just changing the rules. We're saying the whole rotten capitalist system needs to be changed, not just the rules. Never mind tinkering at the rules, the system is fucked. The system needs to be changed. And that's where the discussions we need to have into the future. Not let's just talk about which political party's in charge and what rules or what little crumbs we can get. We want the whole system changed. And I think it's important that conferences like this discuss those issues over the next couple of days, and we do that in our workplaces. Yeah? So I'll leave it there, I'm out of time. Thank you.